Hey everybody. Lately there have been a lot of statements from US leaders denouncing the actions of Russia in the recent invasion of Ukraine. And, there's an outpouring of sympathy for the Ukrainian people with this invasion and this conflict that has become very bloody. And, just conflict is bad in general, but these actions are very belligerent. So many people have asked, why is Russia invading Ukraine? So this video kind of explains the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Why is Russia invading Ukraine? But really we should be asking the question, why is Putin invading Ukraine? I say Putin because while Russia as a whole has been condemned by, many, including President Biden and many in the international community, Russia is also currently being subjected to sanctions, international sanctions on their economy. I really think this should be more of a sanctions on Vladimir Putin himself, and this particular conflict is about Vladimirovich Putin and his efforts to re-Sovietize. And, he wants to reunite Russia with its former satellites. So since I'm a history buff who majored in international studies and I spent a considerable amount of time in Russia studying the Russian language and culture and, Russian literature, the history of Russia itself, I even wrote a report in graduate school on Vladimir Putin and his background. I really wanted to talk a little bit more about this and to give some background and history on it. You really have to understand the history of Russia and Putin to understand what is happening now and why it's happening now. Russia got its name because of the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus were a Slavic tribe. They were led by a ruler named Rurik. He pretty much was in Kiev, which is in modern day Ukraine, and it was the heart of this Slavic tribe of people, the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus people were spread all over Eastern Europe and parts of what, then became the Soviet Union. But they started expanding to Moscow because of the Mongol invasion. So the Mongol Khans invaded Russia from the east. And as a result of this invasion, the Kievan Rus princes, they started to spread to places like Moscow, and they had to pay tributes to the Khans to keep them happy. So as a result, over time, they were able to drive back the Mongol Khans. The Kievan Rus princes, or the Muscovites at that time, once they spread to places that we now recognize as Russia, they began to gain more power. With that power, they started spreading all over Russia. And this is, some of the reasons why Russia is so big and vast is because, just the power that they had from taking tributes from all of these places all over that vast empire during imperial times in Russia. So during Soviet times, Ukrainians were never seen as a Ukrainian country. They were seen as a Soviet satellite, and all of the people from Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan to all of these countries that were part of the former Soviet Union, they were seen as Soviet people. Their riches were all Sovietized and a part of that central you were a Soviet person and everything was shared. And these were, Ukraine in particular was a resource-rich country, and still is. In the 1980s and 90s, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin, got this in Russia, pretty much became this person who started to rise in power. At the time, during the 1980s, he was a KGB agent. He came up through the ranks. He is quoted as saying that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was actually the collapse of the Soviet Union. So fast forward as Putin takes more control and more political power. He became the strong man of Russia, dissolving Russian institutions and silencing dissent. And, at a certain point, he became president. But then, they even put Dmitry Medvedev as a puppet to be president for a little bit, to kind of give this illusion of, okay, we have democratic institutions, but not really. These this kind of quest for more power was something that really was a trademark of Putin, and it was his way of showing his power. But all while this was happening, former Soviet satellites that had kind of always had like this kinship of sorts, they began to show more autonomy. At a certain point, there was a, Ukrainian ruler who was very close with Putin, and, he was driven out of the country, and then they had more democratically elected leaders in Ukraine that maybe aligned a little bit more with the way that the European Union was going. And, then there was the connection of desire to be a part of, NATO. These countries wanted to start to gain membership in the European Union, and they wanted to be a part of NATO. What's NATO, you say? So that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that organization sprang up after World War II. So World War II, you had the Allied powers, which was made up of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other European powers. And then as a response to the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the former Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union at the time, they established the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact was made up of, countries in Eastern Europe. So then you have the creation of the first world countries that are pretty much the NATO-oriented countries. And then you have the second world, which is, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries. With the creation of the Warsaw Pact and NATO, you have, these two forces that essentially are going to fight each other for the next 40 years in a conflict known as the Cold War. So getting back to today and why the conflict is happening, over the years, Putin has pretty much been demanding three things. One is he really wants Soviet satellites, the former Soviet satellites countries, to stop wanting to be a part of the European Union, NATO. He really wants NATO to stop expanding. So he doesn't want NATO expanding and doesn't want NATO to have new members. And his, thought process is the Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. So why is NATO still here? Why do we need NATO at all? And why do, our countries, our kinship, our people of kinship want to be a part of this? Number two, he really does not want Western troops in Eastern Europe. So his demand is to remove Western troops from Eastern Europe. There should be no presence there. And then number three, his demand is that America cannot pledge to help its Eastern European allies should there ever be a conflict. So in other words, he's saying, America stay out of this, or I will go to war with Ukraine and take it back, because in Putin's mind, Ukraine is pretty much the seat of Russian civilization to begin with historically. He's just like, stay away from here. And if you don't stop doing all of these things, I'm going to invade Ukraine and take it back because it's rightfully ours. There was even an article that I read where he summed up the similarities between, what it means to be Ukrainian and what it means to be Russian, and what it means for like Ukrainian-Russian partnership, similar to the relationship between the United States and Canada, where they are culturally similar countries. They're right next to each other and they do business with each other all the time. So they belong together. And so his idea is to take it back by force. And so that's pretty much my summary of why Russia, and particularly Putin, decided to invade Ukraine. And I think this is a senseless war that, it seems that he's just, engaging in this autocratic behavior and deciding to do something without the support of the international community. And, even what do the Ukrainian people actually feel about this? And I think that in some ways he's just like, come on back. And it's just like, do they want to be a part of this? Is this what the people actually want? So, it's really him, making this unilateral decision, and it's costing lives and it's uprooting people. And my heart really goes out to the people of Ukraine, going through this conflict. But I just wanted to really shed some light and explain the history of this conflict and the history of why Putin thinks he needs to and has the right to go in and invade Ukraine. So thanks for listening, and I love history, so I wanted to be able to bring a little historical perspective to the conflict, and thanks for watching. And as they say in the Ukrainian language, do побачення, or goodbye.